So why are the greenhouse gases going up so fast, as we saw in the previous video? Well, if we look at the population growth on the planet, we can see here for the last 12,000 years that the population on planet Earth has been always less than 500 million people. In fact, we can see here that 2,000 years ago we had maybe 190 million people on the planet. In the 1700s, the beginning of the 1700s, 600 million people. And today we're closing in on 8 billion people. And we've gone in maybe 200, 300 years from 500 million up all the way to 8 billion people. A dramatic increase in the number of people living on the planet, using the resources, needing food, generating electricity, all of these producing greenhouse gases. So there's a very good correlation between the number of people living on the planet and the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if we look how the population has grown, we can see that we went from 1 billion people in, say, 1800s, the beginning of the 1800s. It took us 123 years to add the next billion. It took us 33 years to add the next billion. 14 years, the next billion, 13, the next, and so on. So we can see that the population is growing exponentially, and if we don't do something, it's just going to keep on going up. And again, all of these people need resources and need food and are going to be using electricity on the planet. Now, the United Nations has been actually working very hard to try to slow this down, and actually there has been some success. What we see here is a graph going from the 1950s to the turn of the century to 2050, which is the predictions into the future. So the bars are the actual total population given on the left-hand side, the numbers in billions. And the solid line is interesting. This is the fertility rate, the number of children per female on the planet. And the scale is on the right-hand side. We see in the 1950s there were approximately 5 children for every female on the planet. But due to educational projects of the United Nations, birth control, this has dropped dramatically. And at the turn of the century, it was down to around about 3 children for every female. And the forecast and the plans of the United Nations are to get to maybe 2.1 by 2050. But if we're optimistic, we may get to 1.6. If we're pessimistic, maybe 2.6. And based on these 3 scenarios, we'll have different amount of people living on the planet, which are shown by the bars going to 2050. And if we take the optimal road, then by 2050, we may have 9 billion people, but we can see we're getting pretty close to that already. And so here we can see what will happen if we go out, if we predict out into the future past 2100. If we go on the very optimistic scenario of 1.7, the total fertility rate of 1.7, then we may reach a maximum around about 2040, and then population may actually start to decrease. But the maximum is already, we've seemed to have passed that maximum, and so that seems to be already out of the window. If we go on the pessimistic route, the 2.5, 2.6, we can see this is going to keep on going, and by the end of the century, we may have about 15 to 20 billion people. And if we match the target of 2.1, then we may get to around 10 or 11 billion by the end of the century. That may stabilize and then slowly decrease. And obviously, anything higher than 2.5, things will just increase exponentially. Now, it's interesting to see how the population distribution has changed since the 1950s and what's predicted to 2050. Here we can see for basically the different continents, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Oceania. Each of the different colored bars are for different years, 1950, 1995, 2025, and 2050. And we can see that in some regions, like in Europe, we actually have a decrease in population occurring, and it's predicted to continue to decrease. Some of you may know that you could buy an apartment in villages in Italy for €1, but you have to live there. You can't just invest in it. And the same in Japan. There are villages where nobody's living because the population is decreasing and there are no young people anymore. But in other parts of the planet, like in Africa and Asia, we're seeing dramatic increases in the number of people. And this is actually the big worry, because these people are in developing countries like India, Nigeria, where they don't have electricity today. Many of them don't have electricity, they don't have cars, they don't have air conditioners. They're going to want to get to a lifestyle like us, and so they're going to also need resources and energy, and we have to deal with this in the future. Here we can also see the change in the demographics of the world going from the 1950s to 2050 and even the end of the century, 2100. And what's interesting to note here is that the growth from the 1950s, say to the turn of the century, was mainly in Asia, mainly China and in India. China starts with a big number, and even though they have some control on how many children you can have, they start with a billion people, so they've got a big number and are leading the world in the population. India following afterwards. But when we look at what's happening today and in the future, most of the growth is occurring in Africa, in countries like Nigeria, Congo, Tanzania. And so the population has really shifted. The major growth at the end of the 20th century was in Asia. The major growth in the 21st century is going to be in Africa. And this we have to take into account when we want to deal with changing our energy sources and feeding the population, transportation, etc. into the future.